it's a fantasy on my part on the one hand. It's also a dream come true, but I didn't want to take that dream too far. With this chair here, I didn't want to do that. Didn't want to do that. It's a dream come true because in many ways, growing up in Africa, and we were relativizing that today during lunch. Growing up in Africa, we basically drew our emancipation, our dream of freedom by copying people like Angela Davis, basically. But it was relativized quickly for me because they did the same thing in Israel, in India, in Australia, all over the world. So you had people imitating in the 60s Angela Davis, the Black Panthers, the Black Power movement. So, and then I came to the United States and met Angela Davis. So dream come true, fantasy comes through. And when Gina, as she said here, when she was a grad student, we were very good friends, you know, when she was editing that book on Black popular culture. But I always said about Angela that when I grow up, I want to be like her, but I should actually say that about Gina. When I grow up, I want to be like Gina Dent because of, you know, it was, first of all, because of her intellect, her perception of things, how she gets it right away when I met her. You know, my complete was mostly Francophone, and they forced us to read German. So I'm glad her complete was philosophy, language particularly, and so on. But what is really great about this couple for me is that what they do, they derive theory from lived experience, and at the same time take that to a very challenging linguistic level as well, as you saw with Gina today, where you can't just use any word in any way. You have to figure out what you're doing and so on. So you have to stop all the time to think about what you're doing. You know, this lived experience mixed with theory, with rigor, but also with open-mindedness. That is what is, you know, exemplary about my two colleagues here and my two friends. They, you know, I remember with people like Fanon, with people like Edward Gleason that I'll be talking about here, they were always worried about Martinique because Martinique, the arrière-fond culturel of Martinique, the lived experience was missing. You know, so they were taking everything from France. And Gleason went to Tufts University around 72 and saw African Americans in a conference doing call response. He said, we can never have this in Martinique because in Martinique we don't have call, you know, we don't have an experience, a collective, like what do you call imagination that French people will call l'imaginaire. They didn't have this collective imaginaire, you know, that bring them together. That's based on production, consumption, distribution, and so on. And you all have that, and I'm driving at this particular point here. With Angela first, but then also with Gina, they have been working in terms of lived experience on what we all know today as the prison industrial complex. And we have all kind of interpretation of that. People have taken it in different places, but they have worked on this and elaborated theories, articulated theories, derived theories from this. And some of these theories would include abolition feminism, for example, but also include deriving a revolutionary aesthetic in terms of how this is happening. So what is interesting to me to begin this conversation is maybe a two-part question. First, if you can tell us and this is really getting it from the two of you, instead of all the interpretation, usurpation, appropriation that we have around the world. What is abolition? That is not abolition. Let's first abolishing the prisons. Let's go to that first. What is that? What does that mean?
Well, first of all, thank you,
Yes.
Manthia.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and, for inviting us to be here. And it's actually very interesting to see some of the same faces, a few new ones in a different configuration.
Yeah.
So you make us feel as though we have to perform. We now have an audience. But I'll begin, and then I'm sure Gina will have something to add, by saying that we were both a part of a collective. In 1997, that pondered the question of how to encourage people, scholars, activists, journalists, artists, to understand the importance of focusing on the prison crisis, what we then saw as a major prison crisis. At that time, there was very little visibility of the issue of what now is widely known as mass incarceration. And so this was a group of scholars, of advocates, attorneys, artists, activists, a very heterogeneous group that met together to engage in both theoretical and, well, of course, theory is a praxis as well, but to think very specifically about what might be done to encourage a greater visibility of this crisis. First of all, we decided that we would hold a conference. And interestingly, we imagined 300 to 400 people attending this conference, which was going to take place at the University of California, Berkeley. It's a long story, but as it turned out, 3,500 people showed up from all over the world. We called the conference Critical Resistance. Critical resistance, critical in both meanings, that it was critical to resist, but our resistance also had to be critical. Critical resistance beyond the prison industrial complex. And this was the introduction of the term prison industrial complex to a popular audience. Mike Davis, the urban studies scholar, some of you may know his work, had used the term in connection with the California economy, the economy that was very quickly transforming from an agriculturally based economy to a prison economy. So he had used that term. We decided to, with his agreement, of course he participated in the conference, to use this as a description of what we saw as a complex of problems. First of all, the growth of the prison population, and of course the soaring number of prisons that were developing, the emergence of in fields like architecture, criminal justice, and many other fields, the emergence of the prison as a very important source of profit. And so we define prison industrial complex as a set of relations, not simply as the place where people are incarcerated, but as a set of relations that brought economic, political, media issues together. And it's quite interesting that now prison industrial complex has become how many of you are familiar with the term? Yeah, see, in 1996, 97, had one asked that question, probably there would have been no hands, because it was an entirely a new concept. Which is very interesting, because we were hoping to be successful, and we had no idea that it was going to be possible to not only hold a massive conference, and maybe Gina can talk a little bit about the way in which we organize the conference, and because I think it has a lot to do with what we were discussing today in terms of speaking across borders. And so I'll stop here, and I'll add something later probably.
Okay. So let me pause and just say before I answer that, just to say my thanks for the invitation, my great thrill at being with my undergraduate professor. You've heard already my flashbacks. You know, it's amazing the things that come to you when you're once again together. And of course, dear Manthia, for just having been such an important person in my life and having been generous. I think it's really hard for me to overstate the degree to which it's unusual to have powerful intellectual, social, personal connections across the African, African American, Caribbean, Latin American borders that are generative and generous. So I appreciate Manthia has always been someone who's made those relationships possible. So I want to thank you for that and for all I've learned. Yes, exactly.
I'm going to blush.
It's all right. So, yes, I was on the East Coast at the time that the conference was getting organized. So I was long distance at the very beginning of that process. So I wasn't in on the earliest meetings. Angela kept me up to date on what had been going on. She and I had been in a research group together where she was doing some early work on the prisons in 1993
oh, right. That's
or 4.
That's right.
Right. So from that time, I thought of myself as an activist around those issues, but I never thought of myself as taking this up in any larger way. And so this conference was really the first opportunity to think about doing that. And the conference took place in September 1998, and over 3 days. I mean, when she describes how we expected 300 or 400 people, 3,500, you also can't quite imagine how crazy that made everything. I mean, it was thrilling, but it was also, I mean, unbelievably, beautifully chaotic.
And we had no paid administrative staff.
Nothing. I was on a walkie-talkie and whatever, and we were running around. And she had broken her knee, so she was in a wheelchair, and it was truly insane. So, but I think there were some, I have to say, rather brilliant things that came out of that organization because of the diversity inside of it. At a time when really people weren't talking about this, we had trans participants in the group. We had people working on early high school education, people working from psychotherapy, people working from obviously academics, but in different fields. So it was really a rich and interesting group, and of course multiracial, multicultural in all kinds of other ways. And people were interested in immigration. And so a lot of the things that normally are separated off from each other, it was impossible to separate out because of the group. There were about 25 to 30 something people in the organizing committee. Yeah. And so from that came what I think is an important idea for the conference. First of all, we were faced with the problem that all of us who had been thinking about the prison system, and not only the prison system in the United States, but globally, and the U.S.'s contribution of the prison system to the globe, we're also trying to think about how to deal with our biggest problem potentially, which is that prisoners were not going to be able to attend. So those of us in the free world needed to figure out a way to have prisoners involved. So one of the things that I think
we should mention there were prisoners on the organizing committee,
yes.
Even though they were inside. So we wanted to guarantee egalitarian relationship with people who were inside.
From the very beginning.
From the very outset.
Right. So this also meant that people had to be able to participate during the conference. So, I mean, this is 1998, not 2018, trying to figure out how to organize people calling in from the prison to participate in panels where people could listen was not a very easy thing, but it was incredibly important for the conference. It was also important that none of us were allowed to go into our usual professional, intellectual, or social silos. So every panel at the conference, and there were hundreds, right, 200 panels, I think? Yeah. Every panel at the conference was comprised of a group of people who were from whatever different, so we might have an artist and someone who's an historian and someone who is a medical doctor, all together on a panel. And no one had, I mean, there maybe some people were too paranoid and had prepared presentations, but most of us were trying to be there and create a conversation. So it had this kind of dynamism. And none of us saw the entire conference, of course, because of the way it was organized. There were some general plenary panels that all of us shared, but we all took away a very different conference. So you'll probably hear in this a reflection of the kinds of cultural studies, Black studies environments that all of us had been, well, not all of us involved in the conference, but all of us here had been involved in. And I think that was incredibly important to achieving the goal that Angela talked about of popularizing the idea of the prison industrial complex, which was a way of trying to move people from the problem that she was pointing to, which we used to comedically refer to as, the building of the prison is the problem, like the actual thing. My students sometimes think that's the prison industrial complex, like it's over there.
That's the complex of buildings, right?
It's a building. So really trying to get people to think these economic, social, political relations, and at the same time getting people to think about abolition in a way that didn't mean only tearing down. So abolition as a positive project, abolition as a generative project, abolition in the version inherited from those we saw as our predecessors who fought slavery. So racial slavery...
Before can I just add one thing in relation to the organizing of the panels, which I think is important given the conversation you had with the students today about language. What we ask, and Gina's already referred to this, but I just want to make sure that it is as explicit as possible. We ask everyone to reflect on their particular vocabulary, on their particular language. We didn't simply say, oh, academics, don't use your academic jargon, right? We said to social movement activists, reflect on the words that you're using, because they're words that are intelligible within the circles in which you move, but they may not resonate in the same way to other people. And in this way, I think we created conversations that involved the kind of self-reflexivity that we've been, talking about over the course of the last 2 days, developing and retaining a consciousness of the concepts and the words that one uses to express one's ideas and to engage in a kind of translation when necessary. And this was actually really remarkable. because I don't think I've ever experienced another conference that was like that, where you had a prisoner calling in from San Quentin, talking to Estelle Friedman, for example, who is a very prominent historian at Stanford, who was on the panel, and it was so exciting. It was a kind of a utopian space, for a moment.
Except for the broken leg,
Well,
Anyway.
I had forgotten that I broke my knee. So.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, it's hard to capture now, I think, the thrilling quality of the whole encounter. And also, of course, because we incorporated, there were performances, there were musicians involved not only as performers, but on panels, and so, and we all allowed ourselves to be, as Angela's pointing out, but I'll just say this a slightly different way now, to bring our best technologies to bear. So rather than saying, oh, do a layperson's conversation about this, you say, Estelle Friedman might be saying, as an historian trying to work on the women's prison, here's what was in the archive, this is what social history was doing at the time, right? Because it's to assume that would be of interest to other people, would be of interest to people in prison. And I say that because there are a lot of prison education programs emerging now in places, at least in the US that I know about. And they often have a relationship to education which suggests that prisoners need, again, it's a version of what I said earlier about a different group, this kind of remedial education. So what you have to do is take the curriculum that you have, for example, at NYU, and then make an appropriate curriculum that prisoners could handle. I'll just tell you, because we visited many prisons together in our lives and given talks in prisons, our prisoner audiences are much more prepared than all of our undergraduate classrooms.
Well, sometimes graduates.
And graduates. I was trying not to insult anyone here. I'm just saying, and we've been in some pretty bleak environments, including, I think we'll never forget, I always say that it was in another state, but we were in Alabama. We were in Alabama at Staten prison, where the prison population there is about 90% black men, or maybe 95.
More, I would say 98.
And most of the men we met had been in prison since they were about 15, 16, when they sort of started getting in trouble, and they were going to be released when they were probably in their 70s.
Yeah, it was really...
But they were
and amazingly, passionate. They just let us in and let us walk around.
Yeah, and talk to the guy. Anyway,
yeah,
and then we went to the chapel and we gave our talks. But the guys, I was pretty, I don't know, I don't remember, there wasn't much of me, it wasn't internet. They can't search on the internet either. Somehow they had our essays and books, and they had read all kinds of things. I mean, it was astonishing, which, hopefully you won't do this, but some people think that this affirms the work the prison does. That is not what I'm saying.
Well, just recently, Dave Rudiger, who some of you may have read his work, Wages of Whiteness,
and many other books.
He teaches now at the University of Kansas. For many years, he was at the University of Illinois. He was in a prison teaching a course, and of course he went in thinking that he had something really important. And of course he has, I like David, I like his ideas, he has a lot to say. But he said he was so shaken by that experience and by his presuppositions regarding what the class would be like. He said he went in after the prisoners were assigned to read one of his books, I can't remember which one, and it turned out they had read all of his work. And they were arguing, well, Professor Rudiger, in this text you made this point, but in your other work. And he said that had never happened in his graduate seminar
careers. Yeah, right.
You should add professors too, it's not just grad students.
Yes, it's true. We should just make it. We should just make it universal. Yeah. But I think the point is to say, not to emphasize this is how the prison is succeeding, but rather to say, what would it have meant for these people to have access to education? And by education, I'm already asking us to redefine what education means. Because of course, we know for most, and especially for men like that, the kind of education that they would have been offered was the kind that was intended to control them, to keep them from the kind of information that about themselves and the people they come from, and capitalism and racism and everything else. So the fact that they were using this opportunity to form a collectivity that was intellectually engaged and felt connected to the world because of that was really I'll never forget that.
So the issue of abolition, that was actually the question.
So wait, let me just finish before you stop me. Just want to say something about not only, so I talked about a positive abolition, which I think you're going to probably talk more about in a moment, but what did it mean to actually think the term abolition with respect to racial slavery, not because those of us who were organizing believed that the impact of racial slavery had ended, but rather because we could build on a social imaginary that could understand that slavery had been considered something that would never end and had ended. So what does it mean to think the prison in that way? Not as something that has existed for all time and will exist for all time, but as something that came into existence at a particular historical moment and will have an historical end. And what would it mean to think the project of abolition as a positive project of treating that which is the footprint of the prison industrial complex and filling in that footprint differently? So not substituting, let's say, not taking, so back to the notion of the supplement or complement, not finding the thing that's missing and trying to fix it. Not trying to say we need better policing or community policing versus the policing of the local professional cops, or we need prisons for women or for young people that provide different kinds of opportunities, or we need more stronger rules in schools to keep people from violence, but rather to look at things like domestic violence, class relations, racisms, and also an impoverished idea of what education is, to look at healthcare, to look at the fact that of the coordination between the healthcare system and the prison system, to look at the industrial components that were fueling the building of the prison industrial complex, to look at the way in which companies were profiting. One of our classic examples at that time was, we would talk about the fact that MCI, which was a telephone company, was charging, was it 3 times the amount?
Yeah, they still do.
So if you made a phone call just outside the prison, it would cost a certain amount. If someone inside the prison was trying to make that same phone call on the other side of the wall, it would cost 3 times that amount. So these ways in which the prison system was actually generating the need for more and more products and also profiting on prison labor, these were all some of the questions. Right. But the real thing was to be inspired by slavery abolitionists, those who had fought to and struggled for generations to abolish slavery, which didn't happen in 1 year or 10 years or 20 years or 100 years. And to know that we also could be a part of a similar struggle.
The genealogy of abolition is very important and very interesting, of course. As Gina points out, it goes back to the era of the struggle to abolish slavery. But more recently, the notion of abolition as a response to the problems of the prison had been raised by Quakers. And you might find that interesting. But as a matter of fact, the prison itself was invented by religious
Quakers.
Reformers and Quakers as a more humane alternative to existing forms of capital and corporal punishment.
Because you've all read your Foucault, so you know this.
So And so, since Gina brought Foucault into the conversation, Foucault observes that the entire history of the prison has been a history of prison reform. The institution began as an attempt to reform punishment, and if one looks at the history of the institution, one sees increasing efforts to reform the prison. And if one looks very concretely at the history in the U.S., one gets a sense of a kind of pendulum swing, that there are moments when reformers have a profound impact, and therefore there is an emphasis on rehabilitation within the prisons, reducing the violence, and then not long after that, one experiences the pendulum swing to incapacitation. During the administration of Bill Clinton, for example, that was a moment when imprisonment became more repressive, more violent. It was a period during which all of the educational programs within the prison system, there were scores and scores of educational possibilities. Colleges that had actually set up shop within prisons. There's a very interesting film called The Last Graduation, which is about the dismantling of one of these institutions as a result of the passage of the Uniform Crime Act under Bill Clinton. And so, given this tendency for the pendulum swing to happen between incapacitation and rehabilitation, and it's almost always the case that at the moment when incapacitation re-enters, it becomes even more repressive, even more violent. And we were at a moment when we were witnessing the development of what are called super max prisons, super maximum security prisons, which tended to recapitulate the earliest prisons, which focused on solitary confinement. Of course, in those days, the Quakers argued that the solitary confinement was to provide a space for reflection and a space for the development of a relationship with God. But of course, that is completely lacking in the instantiation that occurs in the 90s. Therefore, we decided to reconnect with the abolitionists of the 1970s, the Quaker abolitionists. There was a very interesting text that was published called A Handbook for Abolitionists by, what's her, her name will come to me.
Sorry.
But if you're interested, you can Google Handbook for Abolitionists, because Critical Resistance, which I mentioned before, republished the handbook. And so while we raised abolition at the first conference, it didn't resonate as much as it has begun to resonate in the recent period, because people said, "Are you crazy? You know, what do you mean abolish prisons? What are we going to do with all of the criminals? What are we going to do with all of the murderers and rapists?" The very prospect of abolishing prisons seemed to produce this imaginary of chaos and violence but we insisted.
Yeah, you know, and among the middle-class black people, some of the real reaction, the black middle class would say, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
It seemed like they were even more afraid of criminals than
Yes.
Well,
so-called
in
criminals.
fact,
right,
the crime
right.
bill
Yeah.
under Bill Clinton,
Yeah.
which was co-authored by Carol Moseley Braun, who was the first black woman senator.
That's true.
Right.
That's
Right,
true.
so that period of time and that kind of repression was authored by someone who, coming from inner city Chicago, right, was bringing this idea that we have to actually fortify right, ourselves by using police and prisons and jails. And this is one of the things that made our challenge so difficult.
Yeah. You know, 2 years ago, when we were in Paris, the French people were quite surprised when the two of you brought three elements together: prison, abolition, and feminism.
Yeah, yeah.
And just theorize, tell us about that.
Before, yes, because feminism plays a very prominent role here. As one might say, the whole project has been a feminist project. But what I wanted to point out before moving on, because it relates directly to the work we've been studying, is that Faye Honey Knopf. Faye Honey Knopf is the author of, the first author of the Handbook for Abolitionists. We realized that abolition did not resonate because of the articulation of crime and punishment. Because the assumption was punishment is always linked to crime. And so we realized that we had to engage in a process of disarticulation, which we referred to briefly, I think, in our discussion of Stuart Hall, to disarticulate crime and punishment, so that punishment would not be viewed as only or as the effect of crime, that we had to re-articulate punishment with other phenomena, with other concepts.
Can I just say, just to add to that. So, I mean, maybe this is simple for everyone here, but I think it's been fairly difficult for people to grasp this part, and so I just want to emphasize this. And part of this has to do with the notion that, and this is the good liberals that we all know, that prison conditions and things that happen to prisoners were really deeply unfortunate, and that prison conditions should be ameliorated. But it was very unfortunate, but there was nothing to do about the problem that people were committing these crimes, and that more people of color committed crimes. So that was just an effect. It may have been an effect of their poverty that caused them to commit more crimes. You know that I'm acknowledging them not committing more crimes, right? Okay, so but the understanding was that we can't really do anything about that part. We can make the prisons more, we can give them access to religious practice, we can bring some books in, we can clean them up, we might improve the food slightly, but...
Makes the guards a little less repressive.
Pink up the prison, as we sometimes say. Right, so could do those things, but the reason we couldn't do any more, well, two reasons. I mean, one is that the older legal principle, the principle of less eligibility. The idea that if people on the outside didn't have access to, for example, full health care and education, et cetera, then people in prison should have access to less.
And this is a principle that goes back to Jeremy Bentham.
So that's one part of it. Not to say that people were talking to us and said principle of less eligibility, but that's basically what they're speaking about. The other side of this has to do with the fact that it just seemed impossible to imagine how you could fix the problem unless you actually could fix the problem of crime, which might eventually be fixed, for example, if people got more jobs or something, but it wasn't really something that you could attack. So this is why this problem, this process of disarticulation was so important for us to say that punishment is not a consequence of crime. It's actually a consequence of some other forces, which we have to discuss.
And also, in terms of academic disciplines, the prison is the object of study by criminologists, right? I mean, there's a film called Penology, but criminologists And so, as a side issue, I might point out that that one of the things that evolved out of this campaign was was a new field, an emergent academic field, and we can talk about that if you're interested. That's called critical prison studies. That is to say, an interdisciplinary engagement with the issues of prisons and punishment. But when I say abolition was a feminist project, that means that our analysis of the work that the prison does was a feminist analysis. We attempted to bring things together that usually are not thought in the same space. You're familiar with the notion of intersectionality, which is a kind of unfortunate shortcut for complicated method, so that we pointed out that on the one hand you have the historical conjuncture, and the period of the 1980s, immediately preceding the era during which we did the organizing, was the rise of global capitalism, was the deindustrialization of the economy in the U.S. So we looked at all of the reasons why the prison population had grown so rapidly within the period of the 80s, within the Thatcher period. We were talking about Thatcherism in relation to Stuart Hall, which was, of course, the Reagan Bush years in the U.S. And there were economic conditions that produced surplus populations. So what happens when people lose their job because the factory moves to another part of the world where labor forces are less organized and are cheaper? And we're dealing with the resonances of this issue today in terms of the person who was last elected president. But so we saw the connection between the rise of immigration, the fact that people in those countries where the corporations tended to move, conditions were becoming increasingly unlivable. And so, therefore, we can talk about what happened in Mexico with all of the manufacturing concerns moving on the border and disrupting economies and making it impossible for people to live as they had been living. And what happens within the country is people lose jobs, but at the same time we have the rise of privatization, we have the increasing inaccessibility of health care, education becomes increasingly privatized. And so all of these conditions help to produce populations of people who had nowhere to turn. And so prisons begin to crop up everywhere. And not only do we see a soaring number of prisons, we see the privatization of prisons that moves in line with the privatization of healthcare. One of the things we noticed then was that one of the first healthcare privatization corporations, Hospitals Corporation of America, had an interlocking directorate with one of the first private prison corporations, Corrections Corporation of America. So we were attempting to understand these connections. This is why I say it was a feminist project, because we weren't satisfied with the simple answer that racism is responsible for the fact that 35% of whatever you want to say in terms of the number of people in prison, the huge disparity in terms of the prison populations. We were trying to think in ways that were alien to the disciplines that generally did the work of professionally thinking about the problem of the prison. So abolition becomes the proposal that we make, that we can't simply make these places better. We can't reform them. We have to think about new ways of addressing the problems that the prison purports to address, or attempts to address implicitly, such as literacy and poverty and so forth and so on. And you want to say a few words about the feminist aspect of it? I know you
assignment. So we've been, I suppose maybe for the last at least 5 or so years, been using the term abolition feminism, which doesn't always translate exactly well. But
especially in Europe.
Or in India, where we try some places. So it takes some translation. But the point is to contrast to that which has been characterized as carceral feminism. In other words, one of the most important sites, and one of the reasons why feminism was important to us from the very beginning of the Critical Resistance Project, is that sexual violence and domestic violence were often the things that were most focused on as reasons why decarceration was not practical or reasonable or even just. And because many people were arguing that, many people who worked in the domestic violence arena were very nervous about any work to think about decarceration. And many people who work in those areas and worked, and many of us had a background in thinking about these questions or having been involved with these issues. And so we had to figure out a way to work and to talk with people who felt that the measure of justice was in the length of the sentence for incarceration. In other words, a crime is only as serious as the number of years for the sentence. And so rape was supposed to be made a more serious crime, and if we were going to take it seriously in the world, then we had to take it seriously by saying that the term for rape should be longer. And we had to go against that kind of a logic. In more recent years, that kind of a logic has come to be characterized as carceral. We didn't have that way of talking about it at the time. So we've been talking instead about abolition feminism as the other side of that carceral feminism, which it's important to point out always means that we care as much about those other issues of domestic violence and sexual violence and trans violence and all the issues that get raised as we do, and racial violence, of course, as all the many other issues we're talking about that the prison is a part of. In fact, our argument is that the prison and the prison industrial complex are contributing to those issues. And this can be shown both theoretically, but it can also be shown practically in many ways, even down to, for example, arguments in communities about whether or not new prisons should be built. And one of the arguments always about new prison building is this will bring economic rejuvenation to a poor community, this will make the community safer, and there are many studies which demonstrate that it does the very opposite, that there is an initial kind of economic slight tick upward, but over the long term there is a downward slide, but more importantly for this analysis, domestic violence increases, other forms of violence increase. So the long-term effect of that prison being sited there is as bad for the population that had wanted it as it is for, well, maybe not as bad, but is also bad for the people who wanted that prison. So there was an organization that we also became a part of that there was a conference called Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, that happened at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where we both teach or taught. That conference was organized by the very people who had been involved in the domestic violence movement and had been involved in thinking about these questions, and wanted finally to say that they wanted a balanced attention to interpersonal and state violence. This happened in the early 2000s, and that real shift began to reinforce the prison abolition movement. So it is this kind of abolition feminism which seeks to think about how the prison industrial complex genders, sexualizes, works through capitalism, racializes. It is that overarching framework for abolition that we have been characterizing as abolition feminism.
And so if you're interested in reading about this process of reflecting on the unfortunate role that the anti-violence movement played in generating support for carceral solutions, there is a text by a sociologist who's also an activist in all of these movements. Her name is Beth Ritchie.
R-I-C-H-I-E.
R-I-C-H-I-E. And the title of the text is Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence, and America's Prison Nation. To continue along the lines of Gina's remarks, some very interesting theoretical consequences emerged from this attempt to think about the prison industrial complex and possibilities of abolition. And that has to do with the feminist approaches to violence. And specifically the relationship between state violence and intimate violence. We tended to think the two modes of violence as entirely distinct, as entirely separate. You know, what does police violence have to do with a man beating his female partner? So very interesting work has happened in on that process of connecting, again, thinking together what is usually thought as entirely discrete. So that today when we think about the gun problem, right? And those of you who are familiar with the situation in the U.S., you know that there are more guns in the United States than there are people. And you know about the horrible school shootings and which tended to be thought separately from the violence within Black communities. And so it's really interesting that the young people who are involved in the campaign now have made a point of connecting school shootings with ongoing everyday violence that has claimed the lives of a lot of young Black people in Chicago and other places. So this feminist attempt to think these issues together that have previously been thought apart allows us to recognize the gun issue as a feminist issue. I mean, what better example of toxic masculinity can one discover than someone who than a man, or and when I say a man, I'm not I'm thinking in more complicated terms because I'm talking about socially constructed toxic masculinity, which can be enacted by bodies that are constructed in other ways as well. Okay, and then I have another point, but go
Well, she's not going to say this about herself, so I thought maybe a reference for thinking about this question is actually an essay Angela published in the 90s called Public Imprisonment and Private Violence, Reflections on the Hidden Punishment of Women, which was in which she introduced the concept of the punishment continuum, which precisely did this work of connecting across. I know she's not going to say that, so I can say that. So it's a good thing for you to read to think about this. Okay.
Well, you know, I was reflecting then on the fact that people assume that because the number of women is minuscule compared to men who are in prison, that it's not really an issue that concerns women. It's not a feminist issue. But I was thinking about then the relationship between intimate violence or domestic violence and state violence. And I was trying to reconceive the violence that happens within intimate relationships as a kind of delegation by the state to enact punishment, so that when you say that only 7% of the prison population consists of women, that's a misrepresentation of the violence and repression that women are experiencing. And also, interestingly enough, when one looks at mental institutions, the statistics are exactly the reverse. And so one can argue that psychiatric institutions have been used in much the same way as prisons. So we were trying to think these things together. And this is actually the feminist core of the project. This is why even if we're not talking about women, our approach to the project of the abolition of the prison industrial complex has been feminist. But there's one final point that I want to make, and then I'll see. And that is, the elephant in the room is always capitalism, isn't it? And so we began to rethink the history of the prison as a capitalist institution, as a form of punishment that's really only possible under capitalism. Why is it only possible under capitalism? What does imprisonment consist of? What's the primary goal of imprisonment? In the very first place, what does imprisonment deprive you of? Freedom. Yeah, your rights. It's your liberty. And the whole notion that liberty and rights are possible happens only under capitalism. Happens only with the emergence of bourgeois democracy. So the prison itself is an institution that is thoroughly wedded to capitalism. And so in a sense, to think the abolition of the prison, you also have to think the abolition of capitalism.
If you allow me, unless Gina has something to add here, because I'm looking at my boss over there, and this could go on all night. Oh, wow. It's so fascinating, Oh, wow, and your work is on prisons, but as the lectures yesterday and today illustrate amply, you also talk about music and aesthetics. You talk about the blues as the area. If we talk about the blues, if you look at in the African American tradition all the way to today, you wrote about the blues. Amiri Baraka wrote about the blues people. Frantz Fanon wrote about the blues. all the way to yourself. And blues is seen in many ways. And you just recently just talked about violence. So if you allow me, the audience, because I know this topic is so fascinating, I want to jump to music, aesthetics in the era of Black Lives Matter.
Oh, big jump. Okay.
Well, actually, it's not.
Yes.
I thought a transition.
It's not a big jump.
No.
Okay, well, good.
Because the core of the notion of abolition is imagination. It is precisely about encouraging people to imagine a world in which prisons do not have to exist. Today we were talking about the faculty of the imagination and the central role that it plays. So you can say that there is an aesthetic dimension in the way in which we encourage people to think prison abolition.
And so actually want to pause before I get to the blues to make a little bit of a transition between what we were discussing and this other realm of thinking aesthetics. Because there were a lot of activities that we engaged with in critical resistance after the conference. And one of the things that first happened was a film festival that some of us were involved in organizing. And I remember at the time that I had a lot of trouble because it's always been my interest, and this I think all of you will perhaps appreciate now, to think about the kinds of materials that remain uninterrogated, usually, in the environments where people believe that what you need is actually greater and greater information. What am I trying to say? When organizing a critical resistance film festival, the first thing people wanted to do was show all the documentaries, which there are many, even at the time there were many, and the idea of this, however, is partly troubling to me. The idea that people lack information about incarceration that doesn't allow them to make the correct judgment about what the political outcome should be. And so if we actually fix that problem, so we don't think of the supplement, but we think of the complement, right? What people need that they don't have, then we will actually give them the information that will show them that the prison system is really wrong. Now, I'm not saying that all documentaries are so simple in this way at all, or need to be, but I was deeply interested in thinking about something that I had begun to see from starting to do actual research on prisons. And the research I was doing was on prisons and popular culture. And thinking about the fact that we had no history of visual popular culture in the US that didn't include incarceration as a topic. In fact, one of Edison's first films was a reenactment of an execution. So that, what did that visual history do? I used to do searches, for example, on TV Guide online, and you could find something that represented jails or prisons every hour, every day on TV. But that could be cartoons, comedies, the news, many other things. What did it mean that we were constantly being exposed to material that was giving us a sense that we understood something, back to the term we used earlier today, and yet we had no opportunity to reflect on that as knowledge that we were bringing to bear on decision making. So it's important, actually, just because we've been in this environment where we're talking about these issues, to think about why it's not only about thinking about the blues as a transition, but thinking about how interpreting the blues and thinking about how Black people have related to the blues, the language of the blues, and also how that language has been misinterpreted and used against Black people, can be a part of a conversation, but it's, for me, continuous with the way of thinking how to actually work toward abolition by breaking down some of these categories we have and ways we have of managing artistic production or segregating one kind of aesthetic production from another kind of production.
Yeah, and defamiliarizing people, because precisely because of the saturation of the visual media with images of the prison, people assume that they know, right? And
in fact, they don't. Right? I mean, one day I listened to a military helicopter was above us at home, and I heard the sound and I recognized it. But I realized I had no way of recognizing that sound except from movies. So this is also knowledge. The fact that we often believe that we can segregate that kind of knowledge as like stuff that doesn't impact our judgments from the knowledge that we are, the appropriate information that we are receiving that's going to help us make better decisions is the problem. So that is also, it has to be thought of as knowledge.
You know, one of the interesting moments, and then we'll get to the blues, because it just occurred to me that we had huge discussions about, you know, what kind of posters to use.
Oh yeah.
And you know, people wanted to use bars.
Oh, I wonder if I can find it.
And chains, right? Because that's what you do if you're holding an event that has to do with prisons. You know, these are the objects that will attract people to your event. We decided to pose the question to an artist, a quite well-known local artist whose name is Rupert Garcia. You know, what kind of image would you propose to attract people to attend a conference on critical resistance beyond the prison industrial complex?
I'm trying to see if I can find that poster.
And he came up with this very striking image of an eye, of a large eye.
Oh, here it is.
Oh, okay. The image that he produced, which circulated all over the country, and it was quite interesting because he described it as the eye of surveillance, but also the eye that looks beyond, that eye that looks toward the society to come, right? The horizon, yeah. Okay, right. Let me see. Oh, yeah, there it is, right.
So you don't know if the sun's coming up or down.
Yeah. You see, and I forgot, it says prison, surveillance, punishment, repression. Well, that's actually, this is the poster. Yeah. Yeah.
The resolution is
That's fine. That's fine. Just to give people
Thank you.
a sense. And this was an important discussion because we wanted to defamiliarize people, to not present them with something they thought they already knew, and something that would also compel them to ask, well, what is this about? And maybe that's why we had 3,500 people. And so that begins to move into the area of the relationship between art and political struggle.
Exactly, yes.
And certainly the blues, as a genre, emerged in the aftermath of slavery. We had a brief discussion. When was that? Was that just
Today.
Was that
yesterday?
Was that just yesterday? See, I was going to say last week. We talked about when I talked about the work I had done on
Blues legacies.
on the blues women, and what I think is interesting for purposes of our discussion today is the way in which that tradition is being taken up by young artists who are attempting to connect their work with the the movements that are related to the era of Black Lives Matter. Now, I know that's the name of the course, and we haven't really talked about Black Lives Matter.
It's part of the name of the course.
The movement for Black Lives and all of the various movements that have emerged that are connected to this moment, this particular conjuncture. So, do you think we should play, I don't know, Christian Scott?
Let's have some music.
Ooh, play
Christian Scott? Okay. Would you like to hear an example of someone who works in that tradition, but who is...
It's one of our favorite trumpeters.
Yeah.
Do you want to have video also? Or just
No, I don't think it's a video, right?
I think it is.
Oh, it is?
Let me see. Did I just lose it?
he's coming.
I just lost it. Wait.
I'll bring it to you.
Okay, it's going to be, you know something, first, I wanted to, let me play something a bit older first, okay. Since we're talking about the imagination and aesthetic sensibilities, all of you have heard Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, right? Everybody has heard that. Well, I'm not going to play that because you've heard it. But I do want to play, this is actually quite, this is actually only, it's not an image, only the album. So that would be on page 1, and it's Carmen McRae, Supper Time.
You have it? Did you give him
Give me a second.
You take him a second to...
No problem.
No, he has it.
a minute's good.
Yeah, I had emailed him all of the links. Well, let me just say that Carmen McRae was a jazz singer. McRae, M-C-R-A-E, who is actually one of the best female vocalists in the history of jazz. And when she was alive, she told me this story about a song that she always sang. And I had heard it before. I knew that Ethel Waters had sung it and others. But let's listen to this song, and then I'll tell you.
McRae, so it's that one, you're
See
right where your cursor is.
Right there.
Yep,
right
that's
there.
it.
It's called Supper Time. She's also playing the piano.
I should set the table, 'cause it's supper time. Somehow I'm not able, 'cause that man mine ain't coming home no more. Supper time, kids will soon be yelling for their supper time. How I keep from telling that man mine ain't coming home no more. All I keep explaining when they ask me where he's gone. How can I help from crying when I bring this supper on? How can I remind them to pray at their humble board? How can I be thankful when they start to thank the Lord? Lord, so time I should set the table, 'cause it's supper time. Somehow I'm not able, 'cause that man of mine ain't coming home no
Yeah, it's really incredible. I mean, one of the things about Carmen McRae was that her articulation was always so crystal clear. And this is a song about a lynching. This is a song about a woman who is preparing supper for her children, and her husband has been lynched. It was first sung by Ethel Waters in a musical that was by Irving Berlin in 1933. You know, at a time when the anti-lynching movement was developing. This was on Broadway. As a matter of fact, it was the first time a black performer was in a leading role on Broadway. So Ethel Waters sang this. Ella Fitzgerald sang it afterwards. Nancy Wilson sang it. And what I find so interesting about this song is that it's troubling in a way you can't quite express. One could say, oh, well, if you don't listen carefully, if you don't listen well, it could be about about a woman whose man has left her, which is, you know, one of the themes of the blues. But in the original musical, it was a series of skits that were taken from the headlines of the newspaper. So there was a big banner across the stage that said, "Negro man lynched." And so Ethel Waters sang it under that banner, and it's been passed down from jazz singer to jazz singer to jazz singer, and they don't always tell you exactly what it's about, but they try to perform it in a way that troubles you, that makes you ask, what is going on in this song. And I thought it might be good to begin with this to get a sense of the lineage, that there is a long genealogy of music being produced in this way, not as examples, not as illustrations, but as an integral part of the actual movements. And so the next one is the one before that, the page before that.
Yeah, Christian Scott.
Right here, Kristen Scott. Yeah,
it's called KKPD. Get it? Ku Klux PD.
KKPD.
working with time. You can see you have
Yeah.
to work tomorrow. But I think they should make some concluding remarks on this music and musicians. And then...
Are any of you familiar with Christian Scott? Any of you like jazz?
Yeah.
Okay, well, Christian Scott is,
He doesn't like to be called that anymore.
well,
Atunde Ajula.
Atunde Ajula, Christian Scott, yeah, is one of the most amazing young trumpet players today. And this piece was his response to his own encounter with the police. He was arrested. Since we're using Black Lives Matter as a kind of rubric, one can say that this was his attempt to help generate the kind of resistance to police violence that began to be expressed dramatically, I would say, 4 years later. This album was released in 2010. The Ferguson protest happened in 2014, and I don't want to make a direct connection, but I want to give you a sense of the political context. Do you have anything you want to say?
I mean, we've opened up a whole other topic around which we could speak for many hours. So I just want to say, because we talked yesterday, I think it was yesterday, very briefly, about what it means to think about music and not to think of it only in terms of lyrics. And so the two examples selected here, I think, in different ways comment on that. On the one hand, obviously, the Carmen Cray rendition of Summertime is also about how encoded meanings, to take the old cultural studies terms, I mean, how different communities would actually be able to make meaning of the song. And also how certain kinds of hidden meanings can make it more possible and safer to actually communicate in collectivity. I think the Christian Scott is an important example of someone who's making what he calls stretch music. So a lot of you say you're familiar with him, so you know that he describes his music as stretch music, and he's thinking of, and he really thinks of it in terms of freedom. So in the way that free jazz announced itself, this is a different way of announcing stretching. And coming from New Orleans, where, of course, that jazz environment is controlled by some very prominent people, and one prominent family in particular, his positioning in that environment and in the music is particularly interesting. He shares so much in terms of that background, and yet he has a very different way of relating to what should happen today in the music, and a very different way of thinking about the relationship between social issues and the music. So there's never a literal relationship between this title, in this case KKPD, as in Ku Klux PD, but and so you can't find in the sound some way of thinking this is a diagram for how we should think about this violence extending from slavery till now. But it is also in the way that the music itself opens, and the way in which he relates to the other musicians he improvises with, in which you find that stretching. And so I think they're...
by way of quick conclusion, Chris is telling me that you can pick up the questions tomorrow morning. I just can't resist the temptation of adding one word here, because this is such a gift. I was at Manifesta in Palermo giving a talk with the mayor of the city, who's a communist, a wonderful guy. And somebody asked a question, what is the point about aesthetics, art, literature, all of that? They don't solve problems. We have 400 people in Aquarius, and they can't get into Europe, and they stop them. And the example I gave, and I think this black abstraction that you just saw in the music is much more eloquent. But Avital and I were talking a little bit about this earlier today, about blackness in Western civilization. But it's not just Western civilization, but in Africa too. Because if you look at African American crossing the Atlantic what they take your name away, they take your clothes away, they take your religion away, and then they give you new names and take you to America. If you take that situation and look at the jump and look at the world today, this is what I was telling them. African Americans actually have used struggle and art. They didn't just use struggle. And this is why I was really shaken when there was a conflict between Ta-Nehisi Coates and Cornel West. You know, what kind of art should we use? Art that struggles. But if you look at African Americans, what they teach us, especially in Africa, but also Europe, is that first, when you think about America today, the culture that you think about is Toni Morrison, is jazz, is different kind of. That's what American culture is all over the world today, and they are also teaching Africans, to let go of the affiliation, the rootedness, and emancipate themselves. And that's really what I see in art, and that's what I try to tell people in Palermo. Africans are interested in their authentic roots, Europeans are interested in their authentic roots, but these authenticities cannot take place without oppression, without oppressing other people. So how African American culture is actually giving us this kind of democracy, this kind of abstraction, and I think the gift, it's been so beautiful tonight. I'm really moved beyond words. Thank you so much. And tomorrow you will ask your questions. Please. Thank you. Thank you so much.